Hi everyone, my name is Anne. Thanks for being here. I'm so excited. We are on lesson 14 of your first 15 beginner watercolor lessons. Look at everything we've done back here. It's so exciting. I love the progress that you're all making, and you're doing a great job, and I really hope you keep it up. I'll post more lessons after this series of 15, but for now, let's talk about lesson 14. There's a big holiday coming up, Easter, and for our family, that means family. And whenever family gets together, that means food. And for Easter, we usually like to do a brunch. So I thought we could paint some pancakes. Are you ready? Let's get to it. I'm so excited to get lesson 14 started. We have our Winsor Cotman paints, we've got a kneaded eraser, our Princeton snap brushes, a jar of water, paper towel, pencil, our kneaded eraser, and Paul Rubens block of watercolor paper. That's cold pressed paper, and if you don't have these supplies, just use what you have on hand. But if you're interested in getting some of these, I will put a link in the description to all of these items. Let's get started drawing this beautiful stack of pancakes. It's 4 pancakes. I remember the day when I could eat 4 pancakes, but now like 1 is enough. But I would not complain if this were served to me. Oh my gosh, they look so tasty. Our picture reference today is from Pixabay, but if you have your own pancakes that you'd like to take a picture of and paint, please do. I just like the lighting on this one, and I love blueberries, so this is really a fun one for me. What I'm doing is I'm trying to put in well, first I drew the horizon line. And now we're going to try and put in the areas of the pancakes that have those lighter golden sides. And I'm kind of trying to also note where that top ridge meets with the next pancake. So you're not really making a series of ovals, and I'm not following the reference exactly. I'm just kind of making things a little bit shaky in my drawing. I love how the one on top is kind of dripping over, so I definitely wanted to put that one in. And before I draw these higher pancakes, I want to erase that line that's underneath. Now, when you're using pencil to draw with watercolor, your watercolor won't cover, the pencil lines will tend to show through watercolor. You'll see at the end of this one, it's really minor how they show through. However, if that's something that bothers you, you can definitely use a watercolor pencil and have your drawing meld in with your watercolor and become part of it. Or you can go over your pencil lines when you're done with this kneaded eraser and just make them very, very light. Once you've applied watercolor to your picture, though, you won't be able to erase through it to diminish those pencil lines, so just be aware of that. The pencil I like to use is just a regular Clic pencil that you get from the school supply aisle, and you know, you can use drawing pencils, you can use whatever you want, really. In fact, it's kind of fun if you try and branch out and use some charcoal or something like that, because you can use those the shading to your advantage. So just keep that in mind. If you're more curious about drawing after taking these watercolor lessons and you decide you want to really get into drawing, you know, you can take a look at some pencil or graphite sets and some drawing sets and experiment with them, because when you apply water to charcoal, you can add some really interesting shadows to your drawing. So I'm just kind of making a random stack of blueberries here. I'm not really following what the reference shows, but you know, just whatever blueberries you want to put on top. And then I'm only going to put 3 on the side. I love the blueberry with its little crown there. That's where the blossom was, I assume. And I wanted to be sure and include that one. So I'm going to put that one in right here. If you're having trouble making circles, there are circle templates that you can buy. And there's one by Westcott that I really like. And that might be something that you're interested in getting if you're having trouble making these circles. Another way to get used to making circles is just to practice them, just doodle. And you know, blueberries aren't perfectly round, so none of this has to be 100% perfect. It's your interpretation of this photo, so you know, you do what you want to do. We'll go ahead and get this final blueberry in here, and then we can begin painting. I'm going to go ahead and spray my paints with water to get started. No matter what climate you're in, that can be a good idea to activate your paints. Here today it's exceptionally dry. I'm filming this in February, and It's just really, really dry today, as is typical of Colorado, but today seems more dry than usual. So spraying my paints was kind of essential today. I'm making a pile of blue. I'm going to use both of them. I'm starting with the ultramarine, and then I'm mixing in a little bit of Prussian blue. Blueberries are kind of purplish, but they're also really, really dark. They can almost be black. So the way that I'm going to take this darker is to gradually add more and more alizarin crimson. So all of those three paints, if you're using this palette, are right there together. What I'm doing with this first mix, which is mostly blue with just a touch of alizarin crimson, is just going in and getting the darkest portion of these blueberries covered. The paint mix is kind of watery, and I want to go in and with a very sheer coat at first because I really want to layer these blueberries and get some more shading in them. So I'm starting out with just this very sheer layer, and I'm just going in and leaving a little bit of highlight because I'm not quite sure how I want to approach that. So I'm leaving space. I'm leaving myself some room. That's a good tip for you to remember, that leaving white space for highlights is something that it's really something you just have to get in the habit of doing. I did end up going over these and covering it with a different shade, and then we'll go in and put the actual whiteness to the blueberries in with a colored pencil at the end, because I really love the textural softness that you can get with adding colored pencil to watercolor. And for things like peaches, blueberries, anything that has a natural white texture to the skin and fruit really works well with colored pencil. I apologize for the reflection on those blueberries over there on the right, but they really are the same mix. So now in that same puddle over there, we'll just add a little bit more of the Prussian and alizarin crimson, just kind of adjust it as you go, just so that it's kind of one shade darker than what you've worked on. And now we'll just tap in some of that color wet on wet into all of these blueberries, just really lightly applying that pigment and letting the watercolor do what it wants to do. Wet on wet or damp into wet is such a wonderful technique because you can get these wonderful soft gradients of color. And that is one of the things that really brings me the most joy with watercolor, is watching the paint do what it wants to do. It can also be one of the most frustrating parts of watercolor, but once you've practiced and played with it a little while, you can really come to appreciate how versatile this medium is, and just really be able to, once you know that it wants to do what it wants to do, then you can let it do that and think that you're controlling it. Does that make sense? I think that watercolor sometimes really does have a mind of its own, but the real key in learning how to manipulate water is controlling the amount of water that you use. And it's a perennial lesson. It is something that you will continue to struggle with throughout your watercolor career. I don't think it's a medium that you can ever really truly master. You can definitely get really, really talented with it. And there are artists out there that are far more talented than I am. But I really enjoy the properties of watercolor, and I enjoy teaching that to others. And I hope that you have enjoyed these lessons as much as I've enjoyed teaching them. We're just continuing tapping in the blue on these blueberries. It's a beautiful blue and red. We'll separate a little with this color mix that we're using, and we'll be able to really show some beautiful dimension in this fruit's skin. So now we'll clean up the edges a little bit here and continue to apply this mix of blue, and let's move on to the next darkest level. And once again, we're just going to achieve that by adding more alizarin crimson, and you can see how beautifully dark we can get this purple. It's almost a blackberry color at this point. That's another fun thing I would recommend that you do when you're not working on an actual painting. Just play with your paints. Just start with the blue. Add a little bit, start with the ultramarine rather, add a little bit of that Prussian blue, and then start adding the red in gradual amounts, and just see on a sheet of watercolor paper how dark and how purple you can make this. It's really fun to set up a grid with your paints too. Now I think I'm going to let those blueberries rest for a while, and let's focus on the pancakes. Now I'm going into my cadmium yellow hue. I haven't really rinsed my brush perfectly, and that's okay because we wanted to dull that down just a little. But these edges of the pancakes are beautifully golden. So what I'm doing is just kind of applying a very thin watery layer of this paint to those sides of the pancakes. And I'm kind of leaving some space. Just kind of going in here very loosely right now, Not really sure of how I'm going to put the little highlights, and I didn't add any bubbles on the side. You'll see how I ended up going about this. Another fun way to do these edges of the pancakes would be to just apply this paint, let it dry, and then go in with a colored pencil at the end and add your details that way. So you've got a lot of leeway on this one. It's really a very forgiving subject. Now let's go in with a little bit of burnt umber added to that, and let's just take a peek and see how golden brown we can get this. I don't want to go in with the burnt sienna this time because the edges of the pancakes, I wanted the brown to be just slightly different than the surface. So we're going in with just a touch of burnt umber added to that yellow cadmium, the cadmium yellow hue. And we'll just kind of tap this in wet on wet, not really filling it in, just kind of putting it in random locations, just keeping it very, very loose. Now it's time for some of that burnt sienna. So let's go in there and add that to this mix. And we'll just kind of make this a little bit more golden brown. And I think it's time to work on the surface of these pancakes. Now, the way that we're going to approach this, I first want to dry everything there because I don't want this color to blend with anything that's already there. That's another thing for you to remember when you're working with watercolor. Anything that you are using, watercolor wants to go where water is. So if you're coming in next to something that you finished, make sure that it's completely dry before you get up close to it. Because the watercolor, if it's still damp or wet, it will bleed and leach right into the other piece. And that is a technique you can use to your advantage, but here for this piece, I didn't want to do it that way. So I've mixed up that burnt sienna, and you'll notice over in the palette, it's not completely thoroughly mixed. There's still a little bit of variance in there. And that's another thing that you can remember is when you mix your paints on your palette, if you're looking for kind of a variegated tone on your painting, you don't have to do a complete mix on the palette. Just get them in the same puddle there, and then when you swipe your brush across, you'll pick up different variants, different gradients of that paint. So now I'm going in and tapping in a little bit of darker brown around the base of the blueberries. That's just the burnt umber straight on. And we'll go ahead and add that crispy edge there and just try and get a little more of the shading in. And now I'm going in with a wet brush and just kind of spreading that around. So really what I'm thinking of when I'm doing this is I'm not really referring to the reference so much for all those little bubbles and lines and beautiful griddle marks in the pancakes. What I'm doing is I'm just trying to get a varied shade of brown. And that's something that you can really do to simplify what it is that you're painting. I paint in a very loose style. I enjoy that style. If you want to paint in a more photorealistic style, there's lots of artists on YouTube that you can follow that do that. I follow several of them because I'm fascinated by it. I don't have the patience for it, but I am thoroughly fascinated by some photorealistic painters, but I don't enjoy it because it's a little bit tedious for me. It might be right up your alley though, but yeah, I really like to paint loosely, and I don't think there's any doubt that when this is done, it will be a stack of pancakes. And that's my goal as an artist. That's something to think about too, is what is your goal? Who is this painting for? Is it something just for you? Then have fun. Do whatever you want to do with it. You know, you could try and put a pat of butter on here and make that drip down the sides. You could put a lot of syrup on here. Do whatever you want. For me, for this one, I just thought it looked so nice the way it was, and I'm just trying to replicate this in my style, which is very loose and very forgiving. That way, for me, the paints are a lot more enjoyable, and that's another thing I would encourage you to do, is to continue to enjoy your watercolor. You might find yourself at one point getting to a day when it's not fun and you just don't want to do it. Listen to that voice. It's time to get up and take a walk, leave your studio, go give yourself a mental break. A lot of this is so relaxing because it occupies a different part of your brain. When you have over-occupied any part of your brain, if that makes sense, it can be exhausting and frustrating. So this, just like anything else, take a break from it and you know, give it a minute. And then when you come back, I think you can see whatever it is you were trying to work on and getting stuck with fresh eyes. So let's give this a little dry with the heat tool, and we'll be right back. I'm going back into that same blue mix that I had, and I'm adding a little bit more alizarin crimson because now I really want this to be a dark, dark red. I see a bit of red on the inside of this crown on this blueberry over here, the one that's laying down. And I just want to kind of try and suggest those details a little bit. I don't want to outline them. I just want to kind of put in a suggestion of the edges there. You might see other colors there might be on your monitor. You might see greens or browns. Whatever colors you see, go ahead and add them in. And I'm using a number 6 brush throughout this whole process. If you wanted to switch to your number 4, you sure could, but I just stuck with the number 6. I found that these snap brushes have a pretty good point. So for me, there's not a lot of difference between the 4 and the 6. But if the 4 works better for you, then definitely go to that one. Now I've added some of that red there to the blueberries on top, and now I'm going to go in and work on the shadows of the pancakes. So what I'm doing here is I've taken some burnt umber and I'm just tapping it in along the edges, and now I'm going to get my brush wet and blend those together. I'm just agitating that pigment on the surface of the paper and kind of just blending those together, and that will create some lovely natural shading along the edge of the pancake and just under the pancake that's sitting on top of it. So let's kind of do that on all of these here and just get a little bit more shading in, another layer of beautiful toasty goodness. What do you like to put on your pancakes? My favorite are just plain pancakes with blueberries on top and a little bit of powdered sugar, but don't forget the butter. You have to have real butter if you're going to eat pancakes with me. My daughter likes chocolate chip pancakes, and so did my kids when they were little. I made this last weekend. I made some chocolate waffles. Oh my gosh, they were so good. I found a cookbook that is really good for high altitude baking, and yeah, that can be a challenge. So it's sometimes not as simple as just adding a little bit of flour. Sometimes you have to tweak things a little bit more, but these pictures in this book, this cookbook that I have, really want to make you bake everything. So kind of had breakfast on my mind, I think, when I was working on this one. But chocolate pancakes, chocolate waffles, chocolate chip pancakes, and blueberries on the inside. Oh, that's so good, because then when the blueberries get warm and they burst in your mouth and you have that lovely jammy goodness. Oh, I'm going to make you guys hungry. I'm going to go ahead and finish putting these little shadows in here with the burnt umber. And we'll do that on all of the layers, just going right adjacent to that golden yellow on the sides and blending that in. One thing I do want to be sure and mention, when you're working on the shadows on your blueberries up on the top pancake there, add just a touch of that purpley mix in there, because the light from the blueberries will fall on those pancakes just a little bit. So that will make your shadow look a little bit more dimensional and correct if you add just a touch of that alizarin crimson and blue mix into that shadow color, which is in this case the burnt umber. Now it's time to move along to the sides of the pancakes. So let's reactivate that cadmium yellow hue there with a little bit of burnt sienna in it. And now we're going to just kind of tap in just a little bit here on the edges, not filling it in solidly, but just kind of making little lines here and there just to suggest different layers and the different shadows that would occur in these pancakes. Now here is the part where you could omit this step if you're going to do this part with colored pencils at the end. You could omit this step, or you could do this step and continue to add things in. That's up to you. I just like the way that this looked and felt that it was sufficient, so I decided to stop. Now we're going to go ahead and mix some gray for that wonderful slate table or plate that it's sitting on. The gray that I like to mix is typically with ultramarine and burnt sienna. This time I did put a touch of burnt umber in there because I just wanted to make it a little bit darker. So I'm starting under the pancake. This is the first layer. I have every intention of going over this with a couple more layers, but I just want to get the basic gray in here. And since this area is kind of tight over here on the right with all those blueberries, I'm using my number 6 brush to kind of get this background plate all put in here. And you know, this is something where you kind of have to work quickly, because you'll notice as I'm doing this, I'm getting some brush strokes. And one of the ways that you can work around this is to get the area wet first. I decided to just go wet into dry, but if you were to get this area wet first, then you could avoid some of these brush strokes a little bit. But I managed to work around mine by going in with more layers. So it's awfully hard to work in little narrow areas like this and try and keep everything even. That's something that just comes with practice. And with my climate, with trying to keep everything the same level of moisture and dampness all at once is a challenge in and of itself. So you'll see me go in with more layers and smooth this out. So I definitely want you to see that process so that you can see how to diminish that issue if that certainly comes up for you, because it might. What I want to do now is work on the shadows. So I'm darkening that puddle of gray and just kind of making it a little more blue, a little more burnt sienna, a little more of the ultramarine, a little more burnt sienna, just until you feel that you've got a darker version of it. So I'm going wet into damp here, or damp into wet, and just trying to get these shadows. The first place you're going to put the pigment is where the shadows from the blueberries would fall. And then you can go in with a wet brush and pull it around from there. And we'll also do that with pancakes. We'll just apply the pigment to the base of the pancakes and then pull it around with a wet brush so that you can distribute that and not have any real hard edges. The light in this photo is very soft and diffused, so we're not going to have any sharp shadows in this particular painting. The little details that are good to notice are where these blueberries are casting shadows, and there is a slight shadow from this blueberry on the pancake. So I'm going to go in and tap that in here with paint, and then it did kind of go where I didn't really want it to go. So I will show you how to clean that up at the end. When I turn this sideways, I realized that my horizon line got a little crooked, and I don't want that, so I'm just kind of eyeballing it in. A good way to avoid that, if you want, is to use a ruler. Always an option. I just chose not to do it this time. So now I'm adding in more of that darker pigment because I want it to be darker in the back and lighter in the front where the blueberries are. Now we're going to dry this completely with a heat tool because I'm going to go in and work on that background. Now what I think I will do is you just go in with some water, and your water doesn't have to be totally clean for this process here. And I'm going to use the 3/4 inch stroke brush. I really like the chisel end of this brush because you can really get into those fine areas close to the blueberries. You don't need to leave space this time. I mean, you can, not get all over it, but you don't need to leave a gap, is what I'm trying to say, because what you have already painted is dry. Now you don't want to get too wet next to it because you can reactivate that pigment, as you probably know, and get it disturbed. But now what I'm going to do is just mix some more of that blue into the blue pile I've already used and just tap it in random places. And we'll also go in with some of that gray. I just want this background to be kind of a soft purpley gray that we've used before by using the paints rather that we've used already in this painting. And so what I'm doing is I'm turning it upside down because I want to pull that pigment toward the bottom, which will end up being the top of my painting. I want to have most of the light over by the pancakes that are stacked on the blueberries, so I'm pulling the pigment towards that. When you turn this right side up, it's going to be the upper right corner. And then we'll have it be gradually lighter toward the surface of the slate. So just tapping in different colors from my palette, everything except for that brown, all of the cooler colors on the palette here, the gray and the purple mix, all of those, I'm just putting those in the background on that wet on wet, just kind of mixing it on the paper, getting a varied color just to give it a really nice soft finish. And you'll see me take the corner of that chisel brush and the edges here and just really nuzzle it up close to those blueberries and just get in there. You don't have to switch your brush at all. You can continue to use the same brush throughout this whole process on the background. Okay, and with the exception of that little stray shadow behind the blueberry there, we are finished. Let's go in and use something to finish up these blueberries. You can use your white colored pencil, you can use a white gel pen, or you could even go in with that the fine liner and add some black lines if you like. But look at how nicely this Prismacolor white pencil, and it doesn't have to be Prismacolor, you can use whatever white colored pencil you like. It picks up just enough of the texture from the paper so that you can really get in those lovely soft lighter blue areas that look almost white on the blueberries' skin themselves. And for this I am kind of looking at the reference photo just to kind of see where those white lines are on the blueberries. They're not really lines, but white areas, I guess I should say, on the blueberries, and varying the pressure of my pencil just to try and get some different levels of gradient there. And then this one, right below its crown, has a beautiful, it's almost like a little skirt of white around it. So I'm going to make little eyelash lines coming out of that crown of that blueberry, and then we'll fill in the center to get those little foggy edges as well. And by fill in, I mean you know, just kind of dabble the color pencil in there. I'm not really doing any full-on coloring here. And that one right there, I'll show you a little tip for that of how to get that to look a little smoother. This one on the side, I love how that came out. This one over here that I'm working on now, I think the lines are a little too pronounced. So I'm going in with my kneaded eraser and just blotting that up. And that will help to make those lines a little bit more subtle, and then I can just blend them with the edge of my colored pencil. And now it's time for my favorite part, taking the tape off. Yay! I love this part so much. It's just so encouraging to see that lovely crisp white border. And here we go. Here are our pancakes. Let's go in for just a minute and work on this area right here where the shadow got away from me a little bit. This time I am going to switch to my number 4 brush, and I'm just getting it wet. I'm going to try and lift off some of this shadow up here. So what you're doing when you lift paint off is you just get your brush wet, tap it on a paper towel, and then I'm just loosening that pigment just slightly. And now what I want to do, I don't want to leave any hard lines. Let me just tap that very gently with the paper towel so that I can remove the unwanted parts of that shadow. And do you see what that did? Now the shadow looks almost just right. Let me go ahead and go into that gray mix that we have over here in our palette. That's this one. And while this is still damp a little bit, I'm just going to tap in here at the bottom a little bit of that dark gray, and I'm still using my number 4 brush. So I'm just darkening that shadow just a little bit. And what you're going to want to do is just tap it in right up close there, because if you paint with a stroke or a swiping motion, it might take off more of what you've got down there. So let me just tap this in. Let me get a little bit more in there. There we go. And then this up here for the shadow that's on the pancake, I'm kind of tapping that into the blueberry right there. And now I'm going to go in up here to our gold mix, reactivate that. And let's just add a little bit of detail to the side of the pancake right there. There. Now I think that is an improvement. And some of these things like this you don't notice until you're finished painting. So that's why I always tease. I always go in and tweak something after I've already signed it. But that's the way that I corrected that shadow there, and that might be beneficial to you, so I wanted to show you that process. Thanks again for hanging out with me for this lesson number 14 of our first of 15 beginner watercolor lessons. I hope you feel like you're learning something in this series, and I hope that you are really enjoying painting with watercolor. Have a great week, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye now.